At first glance, the business of Netflix seems straightforward. People watch shows, they pay a subscription, and common sense says the more they watch, the better it is for the company. But once you stop thinking of Netflix as a media company and start seeing it as a recurring revenue system, a more uncomfortable question emerges. What's actually riskier? A user who barely watches and slowly drifts away, or a user who watches too much, knowing that every extra hour of viewing also drives real costs in infrastructure, production, and support. When you look at Netflix's financial reports, the company looked almost contradictory for years. Billions in spending, negative cash flow, constant borrowing. All of that while already being a global market leader. For a traditional business, this would signal a structural failure. For Netflix, it was a deliberate choice. From the very beginning, Netflix made a clear distinction between two things that are often confused: profitability on paper and actual cash flow. The company wasn't burning cash because it didn't understand money. It was burning cash to buy scale. In this model, debt wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a way to buy time. Netflix wasn't borrowing to survive. It was borrowing to move faster and take space early. In streaming, speed matters more than efficiency because user habits form quickly and are extremely hard to change. The company that becomes the default doesn't take the market all at once. It takes it gradually and then holds it for a long time. That's why Netflix financed content with debt. Not because it lacked money, but because it wanted to spend today what the subscription model was expected to generate tomorrow. What really mattered was that this debt wasn't tied to individual projects. It was built around a predictable subscriber base. Investors weren't betting on specific shows. They were watching the stability and trajectory of recurring payments. As long as the subscriber base kept growing, the debt remained manageable because the risk was spread across the entire system. A single failed title barely mattered. It simply disappeared into the catalog. This gave Netflix the freedom to invest in content with negative ROI at the individual project level. The company didn't need every show to pay for itself. Each title served a different function, supporting scale and justifying the pace of investment. But once market growth began to slow, the strategy adjusted. Debt stopped being an accelerator and started demanding discipline, shifting the focus toward positive cash flow and tighter cost control. Within this model, churn was never treated as a disaster. It was built in as a normal movement of the system. Netflix doesn't try to hold on to every individual user. It manages flows, where some leave and others arrive. And what truly matters isn't the composition of the audience, but the stability of total recurring payments. If you strip the shows out of the equation entirely and look at Netflix as a financial structure, it becomes clear that this isn't really a viewing platform. It's a revenue forecasting machine. A film studio gets paid after release. A TV network gets paid during broadcast. Netflix gets paid before the content even exists. Subscriptions arrive regardless of whether a specific project turns out to be a hit. That's why the Netflix catalog looks uneven and sometimes chaotic. This isn't a quality problem, it's a direct consequence of a model where breadth matters more than depth. Many different signals for many different audiences are cheaper and more efficient than a single universal product. In this system, content becomes a consumable input. It doesn't need to last. It doesn't need to define a canon. It doesn't need archival value. Its job is to perform a financial function at a specific moment in time. That's also why Netflix can quietly remove titles, rotate regional libraries, and avoid building a permanent collection. The platform isn't selling a legacy, it's selling access, and access has no memory. As a result, Netflix looks less like a traditional studio and more like an investment fund with an unusual portfolio. Assets constantly change, but the priority remains the same: keeping cash flow stable. And from this point, the introduction of ads and lower price plans starts to make sense. It wasn't a retreat. As market growth slowed, a single universal price stopped capturing the full audience. Advertising made it possible to monetize users who weren't willing to pay full price. without breaking the core subscription model. Cheaper plans didn't replace premium ones, they expanded the system. From a business perspective, advertising opened up a different economic layer for Netflix. Subscription revenue is capped by what users can afford. Advertising budgets are often much larger. That shift allows Netflix to increase average revenue per user, not just through pricing, but through segmentation. Less ideology, more optimization. But as the model becomes more precise, a new vulnerability appears: dependence on external conditions. As long as capital is cheap, debt is easy to service, and subscriptions keep growing, the system looks stable. Once the cost of capital changes, even a well-tuned model is forced to reassess its priorities. For Netflix, this means the primary risk is no longer inside the platform. It's not about shows, not about algorithms, not even about competition for attention. The real risk lives outside, in interest rates, currency shifts, and the purchasing power of different markets. That's why the company increasingly talks less about growth at any cost, and more about efficiency per dollar. Netflix stopped being an American service with subtitles a long time ago. It became a global financial system where different countries play different roles. Some generate profit, others drive growth, and others supply cheaper content. That isn't a cultural strategy, it's accounting. At this point, Netflix stops being a platform built around shows and becomes a tool for balancing costs and revenue at a global scale. Content, pricing, advertising, and plan tiers aren't the product. They're levers. They're used to keep the system stable as conditions change. And this is where the limit of the model starts to appear. Netflix works as long as the subscription stays in the background. As long as the question, "Is this still worth it?" doesn't become a recurring thought. Once users begin consciously reassessing the value every month, inertia disappears, and no amount of optimization can fully replace it. In that sense, Netflix is no longer a media company or a tech startup. It's a mature financial system that doesn't win by being loved. It wins when nothing changes too suddenly. That's where the boundary of the model really is, which is why the future of Netflix isn't about whether it can produce another hit. The real question is whether the subscription can remain a habit in a world where habits are getting more expensive. When incomes grow slower than living costs, even background payments eventually draw attention, and that changes the nature of competition. Netflix isn't just competing with other streaming platforms anymore. It's competing with everything that wants a recurring place in a person's budget. Other subscriptions, bundled services, discounts, and sometimes simply the decision to pay for nothing at all this month. In this environment, the winner isn't the company with the best content. It's the one that stays invisible the longest. And that's where it becomes clear why Netflix moves so carefully. It can't change the product abruptly, because abrupt changes force people to think. And thinking is the enemy of subscription inertia. That's why Netflix's biggest moves rarely look dramatic. Price increases are gradual, ads are limited, plans are segmented. Nothing is meant to feel like an event. Because the moment something feels like an event is the moment a user pauses and starts doing the math. This is the paradox of a mature subscription model. The more precisely it's tuned, the less noticeable it has to be. The ideal scenario for Netflix is simple. The payment goes through, content updates, the catalog shifts, and the user never feels a clear breaking point. But that precision is also the core limitation. Netflix can't raise revenue per user indefinitely without drawing attention. It can't cut costs endlessly without affecting the product's appeal. And it can't keep expanding the model forever without making it more complex. Which means the future of Netflix isn't really about innovation. It's about balance. Balance between price and invisibility, between scale and cost, between optimization and overload. And this is where Netflix becomes interesting, not just as a company, but as a case study in what happens to any subscription business at maturity. When growth ends and management begins, when strategy gives way to accounting, and when the most valuable asset is no longer the product, but stability. In that sense, Netflix isn't an exception. It's simply one of the first to reach this stage at a global scale. And how it maintains that balance going forward won't just define its own future, it will define the limits of the entire subscription economy. At this point, Netflix doesn't need to win, it just needs not to break.